Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen into a wide-ranging conversation hosted by Steve Slick of the Intelligence Studies Project in the Strauss Center at the University of Texas at Austin about the role of intelligence in the COVID-19 pandemic. Steve is joined by Paul Pope and Bobby Chesney, also at the Strauss Center, and by Calder Walton of the Harvard Kennedy School. Their discussion includes the question of whether the failure to properly anticipate and warn about the pandemic constitutes an intelligence failure, about what changes might be required in the intelligence community in the wake of the COVID pandemic, as well as what type of investigation or inquiry along the lines of a 9/11 commission might be appropriate in order to learn lessons and incorporate changes for both the intelligence community and the whole of government in the wake of the pandemic. Let's listen in.
Welcome to the Horns of a Dilemma podcast. I'm Steve Slick, the Director of the Intelligence Studies Project at the University of Texas at Austin. It's April 10th, 2020, and I'm sitting in my breakfast room in beautiful Austin. The working title for our conversation this morning is Intelligence in the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm joined today over Zoom by three distinguished national security scholars, experts, and fortunate for me, my colleagues. I can see my guest on screen, but unless there's already been a security breakdown of some sort, you listeners cannot. So we have with us today Bobby Chesney, Director of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and the Associate Dean of the Law School at the University of Texas. My colleague Paul Pope, who's a Senior Fellow at the University of Texas's Intelligence Studies Project, and Calder Walton from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who just reminded me that he's now the Director of Research at Harvard Kennedy School Intelligence Project, and he's also the Assistant Director of the Applied History Project at Harvard. So, good morning to each of you. Thanks for joining. And also thanks to Elizabeth Dowdy from the Clements Center for National Security here at UT. She's been organizing the technical aspects of our session today. So I'll give you the very short version, the very short backstory on this podcast. Calder reached out to us, I guess, about a week and a half ago now. Said he'd been thinking about this topic, as had we, and that he was working on an essay. Now, in the meantime, before it's taken us to get this podcast organized, Calder has already posted that essay on foreignpolicy.com. I encourage you to go find it there on the website. It's a good read. You'll also remember that at the start of this week, the Surgeon General was warning all Americans, that this pandemic would likely be this generation's Pearl Harbor or 9/11. Well, those events have a special meaning for people who study American intelligence. And finally, for my part, I've seen in the media what appeared to me to be the opening salvos in a coming battle to shape the narrative of what actually happened with this emergency. Who knew what? When did they know it? And most importantly, who should bear the historic accountability for what's truly an exceptional national tragedy? And I expect that this battle is certainly going to grow in intensity over the coming months. So with that, I'm going to turn to my friend Paul Pope and ask him to address the most attention-grabbing headline I've seen in recent days. It goes something like this: the coronavirus is the worst intelligence failure in U.S. history. So Paul, how do you react to that? Is this an intelligence failure or something else?
Yeah. Hey, Steve, thanks for having us and for hosting. I think it is an intelligence failure. I'm going to jump to another question, which is is it an intel failure or a policy failure? And I think that it's probably a mistake to frame it that way. The way I like to think of strategic warning in particular is it's a part of the intelligence in that case is part of the enterprise, the national security enterprise, if you will. So this was a failure of strategic warning, but in examining that, we need to look at the whole national security enterprise and not divide it into sort of intelligence and policy. You know, what I like to tell my students is that, the intel cycle that we all use is really just an assembly line of what intelligence people do. But when you're evaluating performance of the warning process, you have to look at not only whether the rightness or the wrongness of the intelligence, but whether it informed policy, whether it was persuasive, whether it was believed, whether it was acted upon. So I think this was a warning. One last thing on the strategic warning. There's 4 ways that Ephraim Comm said there are 4 ways that strategic warning can fail. You can be wrong about whether you cannot expect an attack at all, for example, an event at all. You can be wrong about when it will happen. You can be wrong about where it will happen, and you can be wrong about how it will happen. In this case, most cases, to take Pearl Harbor, the Pearl Harbor analogy, most cases it's sort of one or two of those. Like, everybody believed we'd be at war with Japan, and they even believed it'd be soon, but they were surprised by where. In this case, there are individuals who kind of got all four of those right, and then important players who sort of got all four of them wrong. So, yeah, it's a strategic warning failure.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Before I ask you, Calder, to take a cut at this, we will dig into this a little bit deeper and sort of establish a factual predicate. But at first blush, what do you think about the claim that this is an intelligence failure, or moreover, the worst intelligence failure in American history, which is quite a standard?
Well, first of all, everyone, Steve, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be participating in this podcast. I think, for me, I think it's important to sort of step back and try to understand what the purpose of intelligence is in government decision-making. And it seems to me when you strip away everything, the purpose of intelligence, it seems to me, is to provide decision makers with an advantage in their decisions. Now, this is traditionally, as we just mentioned in the intelligence cycle, through collection, analysis, and dissemination. And I think I'd like to just push back at the idea that this is an intelligence failure. If you look at it another way, an intelligence community can do everything it can up to the point of giving information over to a decision maker. But it's always going to be up to the decision maker to either accept that information or reject it. So put another way, how can an intelligence service persuade a decision maker that doesn't want to be persuaded about things? And there are certainly historical examples of that. I'm thinking in particular about, for example, British intelligence in the Munich crisis. We now know from declassified records that British intelligence was providing really robust warnings to the British government during the Munich crisis, saying that Hitler was not going to stop at just taking Czechoslovakia. And Chamberlain completely ignored those warnings. It comes a point when it's actually impossible for an intelligence service in even the most robust warnings to exert influence over a decision maker. Now, we're far too close to events right now, it seems to me, to actually be able to call out whether this was an intelligence failure or a policy failure, or where that nexus of the failure existed, if it was a 9/11, similar to 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. This is going to have to be studied and scrutinized, it seems to me, by a commission going forward. So those are my thoughts. I would regard this as actually an example of where the intelligence community appears, emphasis on the word appears, because the documents are not available and we're just basing this on reporting, appears to have told truth to power about warnings that they saw coming. And for whatever reason, either decision makers in the White House chose to ignore it because they didn't want to believe it, or actually that communication journey between the intelligence community, the warnings, those assessments, and the decision makers broke down. So
thanks, Calder. And I would like to drill down on several of the points that you raised there. I think we'll get to those a little bit later in the discussion. But you're describing to me this line that's oft quoted. It's been attributed, I think, to Henry Kissinger, and also the last time I heard it to Secretary of State Colin Powell. And that's this business of you told me, but you didn't persuade me, right? Which seems to me in most cases a policymaker's way of trying to offload some of the responsibility to the intelligence community for not just alerting them to an impending danger, but not being strident enough, not being loud enough in their warnings, and not insisting on some sort of follow-up action. And we can talk about whether that's really a proper responsibility for the deliverer of intelligence in this case. Bobby, do you have a first blush cut at that? Intelligence failure or not?
Well, I thought you were going to quote the famous saying that there are only policy successes and intelligence failures, right? Look, another version of your point is that you told me, but I didn't listen. And my only observation at this point is to say that you can lead horses to water. You can't make them drink all the time. There will be, I think over time, we will have some kind of historical record that will show that there was a lot of warning here. We're already seeing the first drafts of history on that in the newspapers. And the debate will be over the extent to which that is the transparency of post hoc review, or if in fact it was sufficiently clear as events were unfolding that this was the proverbial lights blinking red moment.
Yeah, thanks. That makes perfect sense. And since Calder, you've been tracking this as closely as anybody and have done some research for your essay, why don't you build the foundation under this? What's been reported? What do we think we know about the timeline in terms of intelligence informing, intelligence warning, and then the White House response that, of course, we've all been following assiduously for weeks. But I think we have to probably go back to November if I'm reading the media correctly. So can you track us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the fundamental problems about discussing contemporary history is how quickly events seem to change almost each day when we're reporting this. There was a report, as your listeners will might recall, there was a report earlier this week that the agency in question, the National Center for Medical Intelligence, reportedly issued a warning in November about the growing threat of the coronavirus turning into a pandemic. Now, the head of the agency actually took the unusual step in saying that was not the case, that they did not issue an intelligence product. Now, there are all sorts of questions about that. In November, did it happen later on? Because there is growing reports that in January, certainly in January, the U.S. intelligence community was warning the White House about the threat of the coronavirus turning into a pandemic and reaching into the United States. There's actually a long history of this. I mean, you can go back further that the ODNI, the head of the U.S. intelligence in their worldwide threat assessment in January 2019, warned pretty clearly, expressly, about the threat of a next flu or pandemic threatening the United States. This was squarely in their January 2019 worldwide threat assessment. Now, we are all waiting to see where the 2020 worldwide threat assessment is. It was supposed to have been released in January. It hasn't been. I'm going to certainly be looking at that very carefully when it is declassified to see what it says about the so-called under the category human security, because that's how they list pandemics. And then, going back a little bit further, the U.S. the National Intelligence Council issued a report about global trends in 2017, discussing, for example, different scenarios, imagined futures, what will happen if. And one of the imagined scenarios in the 2017 report talked about a global pandemic that, quote, drastically reduced global travel in an effort to contain the spread of the disease, contributed to the slowing of global trade and the decreased productivity, end of quote. It goes on to say, quote, the combination of these events led to a more defensive, segmented world as anxious states sought to metaphorically and physically wall themselves off from external challenges, becoming islands in a sea of volatility, end of quote. Well, that all sounds pretty clear to what we're seeing unfolding in real time in front of us all.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Calder. And you mentioned it, and also I think excerpted it in your essay. For listeners who may not have seen it, I think when we get around to building this historic narrative, a consensus view of what actually happened in this case, and get around to issues of accountability, we're likely all going to become familiar with these couple of lines that were in the 2019 worldwide threat testimony. So I'll just share them since I have them here in front of me. It says, we assess that the United States and the world will remain vulnerable to the next flu pandemic or large-scale outbreak of a contagious disease that could lead to massive rates of death and disability, severely affect the world economy, strain international resources, and increase calls on the United States for support. So again, I think when we get around to these sort of accountability issues, investigations, inquiries into this is probably not unlike in the 9/11 context, the infamous PDB from early August, and the question of whether a president was or was not adequately warned of a danger. Before we get off this, I just want to, excuse me for preaching on this, but I'm a moderator who can't resist in this case. The question of how we know this, in particular, these claims that I think were first reported by the Washington Post, that even in the president's personal morning briefing, the president's daily brief, in the first several days of January, there was some sort of attention paid, some sort of article that would have presented the community's view and what was known at the time to the president. So that's all out there. Now, I know this sounds like a broken record for national security professionals, but I'd just like to offer my criticism and outrage about that. This is not a question of being sympathetic or being fair to the president or not being fair to the president, but somebody leaked that to one or several newspapers, and apparently it was more than one source. And even my lawyer, Bobby, will help me clarify this, but this is a crime for releasing information that presumably is classified. I presume their motives were to defend the institution of the intelligence community, because the president was quite actively trying to avoid any accountability, any responsibility for this, claiming that he was surprised like everybody else was surprised. But it just seems to me if the aim of these folks, whether they were either authorized or unauthorized to make these leaks to the media, was to help the intelligence community in this struggle to write the narrative, it seems to me they failed miserably and have done a lot of harm in the process. Because what they've in fact done is further poison what we're probably going to learn to be the worst relationship between U.S. intelligence and a chief executive, a commander-in-chief, in the 75-year history of U.S. intelligence. And at a time like this, where we really need to do everything possible to keep the president engaged, well-informed, and making sound decisions on this front, to further poison the waters between U.S. intelligence and the president by trying to get into finger-pointing about who knew what when, that's obviously incomplete and obviously intended to manipulate public perceptions. I just think it's wrong and it's stupid, and it doesn't help. So we just file that personal missive away. Paul, I want to come back to you if I may. You mentioned it, and you spend a lot of time in class, I know, talking about this important relationship, maybe the most important relationship in thinking about U.S. intelligence, between the providers of intelligence and the policymaker who has the actual constitutional responsibility to take actions and is in most cases elected by the people. So I'm worried about not just U.S. intelligence being singled out here, but what may be different as we further explore this particular set of facts is, what about the rest of the U.S. national security enterprise, particularly that functions around health issues like this one? So I'm talking about the CDC, Health and Human Services, the White House Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor, the Congress. It seems to me one of the things we're learning as the revelations come forward is that there were a lot of people who were aware of these dangers. There are a lot of people who are doing research and writing and giving a lot of serious thought to these topics. And a number of them were feeding that information up into the White House, in the National Security Council, into the West Wing, or through regular cabinet channels into people in the circle of the president. So how should we think about sort of singling out the responsibility and the obligations of the intelligence community in a case like this from the rest of the government? Given the extensive overlap on health science issues between what the intelligence community does and what other parts of the government are responsible for. Do you have a thought on that, Paul?
Yeah, it's a complex question. I mean, obviously, the intel community is not the only community that has information and does analysis and informs governmental decision making. So obviously and importantly, these other folks play a role. I think that what this really illustrates is it illustrates a couple of things. First of all, in the United States in particular, I think we're sort of spoiled, and frankly, I think much of the rest of the world is kind of spoiled by sort of Western and advanced countries' gathering of information. We kind of rely on it maybe more than we should. And what I mean by that is, I think we rely on sort of perfect, actionable, just-in-time intelligence and warning. And what we've had, what Calder was describing earlier, some of that I would call general warning. Okay, there's going to be an epidemic. We're not sure when it's going to come. Going back to my where, when, whether. I think one of the problems is there's sort of like a binary switch that we expect to flip. And a lot of experts have been trying to flip that switch into a preparation mode for a long time. And so to answer one part of your question, I think is this just the IC? And the answer is no, it's not just the IC. Another point I want to make here is there's parts of this question that are secrets. They're knowable things, like how long does it take the virus to incubate, or what? There's some things that we're going to have some hard data about. And then there are big parts of how this is going to play out that are mysteries, that are complex, nonlinear, chaotic things. And you're going to have to sort of model and keep up with that. You're not going to get a predictive analysis that says this is what's going to happen. So you're going to need those experts from CDC and places like that. I'll save this for later, but I think a merging of a lot of the IC's tradecraft with some of these other experts' way of doing things would be very useful. In other words, I think the IC, I'm not talking about who's to blame. I'm now talking about what do we contribute. We need the expertise from these other groups, but we need more and better IC tradecraft. And what I mean by that is, for example, the ability to make assessments and express them clearly without all the data, as an example. Okay, the ability to separate signal from noise and give policymakers what they most need to know. So I think there's a kind of a flying task force that needs to be created here. A government enterprise is being created to work the intel part of this. And like all other unique crises, it'll be strange bedfellows. There'll be people that are part of the IC or talking to the IC that we don't normally see doing that.
Thanks, Paul. I think I'd like to turn now, if I can, to this issue of establishing the record and assigning accountability. I just noticed in the last several days that in the House of Representatives, there's been some activity on that front in two specific cases. I think one committee has started to undertake an investigation of the run-up to the pandemic's arrival, or the virus's arrival here in the United States. And in another case, there's talk about legislation that would establish a national commission, a nonpartisan commission at some point. Now, these are obviously very, very early feelers in what will be I expect, a highly contentious and an important exercise. But it is one of the most admirable qualities of our system of government, is that when something goes badly wrong and we suffer harm, we do reliably return to the issue, right? Things don't get swept under the rug. We have a long history of establishing the factual predicate in these cases, establishing the record, and then ultimately holding people accountable and learning lessons to keep crises like this from recurring. I think, Bobby, I'd like you to take a crack at this. Looking at the sort of the political calendar, the political landscape, the complexity of the facts, and frankly, the enormous challenge we face right now domestically, saving lives and getting ahead of the spread of this virus. When's the right time to start this process of establishing what happened, holding people historically and politically accountable, and as I say, keeping this from happening again? How do you think about that?
Well, it's hard not to look at that question without thinking of it through the lens of the upcoming election. I think we all understand that the next many months will be filled with narratives and counter narratives that are designed to have an effect in that space. And as fitting as that might be from certain points of view, and inevitable as it is, it's not probably going to be conducive to the sort of reflection that I think of in terms of the 9/11 Commission report as being a paradigm example. So yes, there will be a lot of assignment of blame in the months ahead, but hopefully it'll be a question for the following year, and ideally a circumstance in which we are not still in the throes of fighting over the legal and policy aspects of how we manage the response to the pandemic while it's still going. Once we get on the other side of this thing, and hopefully this is sooner rather than later, but also on the other side of the election, whoever's in charge at that point, that seems like the right time to begin doing this sort of reflective exercise. But I don't see why we shouldn't pursue exactly the model of the 9/11 Commission report here, a bipartisan commission that's staffed by talented people that have the attention of the country and get treated seriously in a way that is not typical of how these government investigations often get treated.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bobby. And that's where I was going next. I mean, you mentioned the 9/11 Commission, which is, for many of us, very, very fresh in our minds, and I think stands as an example that most people would accept as a highly successful, nonpartisan investigative effort. It wasn't the only effort to unpack what happened in regard of the 9/11 attacks, but it was the one that I think will stand the test of time, and frankly served as a basis for restructuring a good bit of the national security establishment. Speaking in that case of the establishment of the Office of Director of National Intelligence and the National Counterterrorism Center. Calder, I'd like to give you a crack at that as a historian. I was just doing some looking back at Justice Owen J. Roberts and the investigation of Pearl Harbor and Earl Warren and the Kennedy assassinations, 9/11, a more recent example. What do you draw from some of these historic analogies about the right way to tackle a highly emotional, partisan, but important question that the country needs to have answered? How do you think about this?
Well, as you said, Steve, I think that the beauty of the US system is the ability to be able to go back and to have a look at this after a national tragedy of whether it be Pearl Harbor or the Kennedy assassination or the 9/11. And I think that the 9/11 Commission really does stand out as the sort of the model for the kind of effort that we want to undertake with this national and international tragedy. I think that, the 9/11 Commission, it was obviously a different kind of tragedy. The 9/11 Commission got, if I remember right, established perhaps just over a year after 9/11. And obviously the type of disaster then allowed for there to be an element of closure. But when are we actually going to see closure with this tragedy unfolding? Is it when there's a vaccine? Is it when, if this is hopefully just a one peak now and there isn't a resurgence? Who knows? But as Bobby said earlier, I think it has to be when the present looming election is out of the way, and whatever government is in place after that, I think that that's the time to start to go back and have a look at this. But first and foremost, we can't be having, it seems to me, an in-depth inquiry into what happened while the underlying issue is still going on, while the pandemic is still raging. I would also just add that there are models out there for what not to do. What we don't want to have is what the British government had with the Chilcot inquiry into weapons of mass destruction, which took over 10 years, I think, to write its final report. It's a brilliant report, but that's far too long for the kind of what we want to have here. We want to have something much more akin to the 9/11 Commission.
I want to turn to Paul again with the same question, but before doing that, when you and Bobby were referring to the fact of letting the dust settle, letting us get through the worst of the crisis, or getting through the political season in which this sort of thing is going to be very difficult to do. I'm reminded of one of the criticisms at the time by the people leading the intelligence community of the 9/11 Commission's work, because it didn't start for a year and a half after the attacks. It wasn't delivered to the president until 2004. And it was, I think, I do agree with you, it was a tremendously important and well-executed effort on lots of levels. On the other hand, the intelligence community they were writing about in 2003 and 2004 didn't exist. It wasn't the same one that existed on September 11th, 2001. So many changes had been made, so many new relationships, so many new procedures, so many relationships had been shifted, thinking of domestic and overseas focused agencies. And so there is that hazard of waiting too long and analyzing a set of bureaucracies and institutions and political leaders who aren't in the jobs anymore and don't look that way anymore. And so there's a fine balance there to be had. Paul, your thoughts on accountability and the right way to look into this, and more importantly, maybe when to do it?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I agree with the comments my colleagues have made here and don't want to repeat those, but just a couple of points I would make. One is to be very clear on Bobby's point, and actually to tie it to your point earlier, Steve, about leaks. I mean, you were kind of, we hit your leak hot button there. I feel the same way about this discussion of accountability, and heads will roll. I think a lot of people are going to try to use it politically. It would be better if we could come up with a actual decision that we're going to do a commission, but we're not going to do it until some point in the future, and get that out of the way. Because the reason that's so important is not because it's unfair or politically charged or we can't do it in election year only. It's because it interferes with learning lessons that we need to learn right now for what's going on. We need to not have intel and other parts of truth speaking and expertise become a political football that's being used by one side against the other when we're still in the middle of the crisis. So I'm very worried about this being so politically charged. And even this podcast, I'm concerned that we not be appearing to be, out for some kind of political hay here. And the other thing that I'm really interested about this accountability board, or whatever we call it, is what lessons are we trying to learn? How do we frame it? For example, if you framed it as looking at the performance of the intel community, in my opinion, you're missing half of the story. And I don't think it will be framed that way. But one thing I'm really curious about that we can kind of tee up, I'll just tee up for later parts of this conversation, is do we go and rebuild the barn, after the horses are out with regard to dealing with pandemics? Or do we look at a much broader set of how the government is organized to be prepared for crises and management in ways that would apply in other areas, for example, cyber as one example?
Thanks, Paul. And so what I took away from that was, from each of your responses, was this issue of change, right? Now, ideally, the change will be informed by an objective, nonpartisan investigation and some views by some smart folks. But as I tried to stress, change started immediately. The day after this was recognized for the global crisis that it is, just as it did on September 12, 2001. And so I recognize you again, Calder, for your terrific essay. You took a first crack at this. You enumerated a series of ways and qualities and mechanisms that the IC is going to be different as a result of this going forward. You want to step us through your thinking on that? What's the IC going to look like after this crisis, from where you sit now and what you know now?
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems to me that we really are at a turning point for US and international security to deal with pandemics and to make sure that this never happens again, and reforming intelligence to make sure that this hopefully never happens again. And it seems to me that in the article, I thought of 4 different areas in which the US intelligence community and international intelligence communities can provide assistance to policymakers going forward in warning about pandemics and dealing with it. The first one is producing assessments about, first and foremost, COVID-19, but other pandemics going forward as well, the threats of them. So this is, as we already talked about, there had been apparently assessments, and this will need to obviously carry on in the future. And we can hope that for whatever reason those assessments were not reaching the right people in the White House, that is no longer happening. So assessments about the impact of the virus and its spread, that would be the first thing. It seems to me that the U.S. intelligence community has. This gets back to one of the earlier points that we talked about what unique capabilities does the U.S. intelligence community have in dealing with assessment of the pandemic. And this is really, it seems to me, concerned with spying, if you like, quote unquote spying, intelligence collection, that the U.S. intelligence community has unique capabilities that other branches of government simply don't have about obtaining information that foreign states in particular want to be kept, want to be secret. So this is, this might involve the age-old technique of espionage, of recruiting human spies in foreign governments that might well provide insights into what those foreign governments are doing about the virus. Are they being transparent and truthful about the figures of infected cases? And then, of course, there's the entire wealth of phenomenal technical intelligence capabilities that the U.S. intelligence community has, from imagery intelligence through to signals intelligence, that again may well provide information about the what foreign states are doing in terms of the virus, and whether they are actually verifying whether they are actually doing what they say they're doing in terms of the pandemic. Disinformation, countering disinformation, is another area that I think is going to become only increasingly more important as we go forward, especially as the election, the US election approaches. I can easily see a scenario in which foreign states in particular, I'm thinking Russia, exploits the pandemic within the US domestic political audience. It's pretty easy to imagine a scenario in which online trolls are producing, from the Internet Research Agency in Russia, are producing information saying, well, of course, you can't trust your government. Look how badly your government, the US government, is treating its own citizens. This will be pushing it an open door, it seems to me, in terms of exploiting a growing discontent within the US society. And then, of course, we have the news now that the pandemic is disproportionately affecting African and American and minority populations. And this is a long-standing sort of trend within foreign state disinformation, exploiting those existing grievances. So those are three of the areas that came to mind in my when I was thinking about this. Covert action is another one that it seems to me that we've already got reports of the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Service, Mossad, apparently undertaking a covert operation to obtain testing kits. This may, if documents come out, this may we may well find more of operations by different governments doing similar. So those are some initial thoughts.
Thanks for that, Calder. In listening to you talk about the disinformation that maybe inevitably has arisen in the aftermath, or to shape our understanding of this health emergency, I know you've done an extensive amount of research along with Chris Andrew on the Russian playbook here. You want to just take a second and talk about the most obvious metaphor, infection, and the way the Russians took advantage of a not dissimilar situation, and no reason to expect they won't revert to that playbook. And even some reporting I've read that indicates the Chinese are in the same playbook as they attempt to shape how people see this, and in particular the United States culpability in the matter.
That's right. Well, soon after, as the coronavirus pandemic spread, there was a theory being popularized by the Chinese government itself that the virus was somehow imported to China by the US military. And for anyone that's familiar with the history of Cold War disinformation, this immediately rang a bell for me. The parallels with the KGB Soviet intelligence disinformation operation about the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s are clear and striking. So it seems to be the case that when we're faced with otherwise inexplicable events, a virus without a cure, that people in societies look for explanations, and that the hidden hand of a foreign government is a clear way of explaining those otherwise inexplicable things. In the 1980s, as the AIDS pandemic took off, the Soviet intelligence exploited this to manufacture a conspiracy theory that the AIDS virus was manufactured by the US military at a biological weapons research establishment at Fort Detrick in Maryland. Ironically, the site of the same agency, the National Center for Medical Intelligence, that is now at the forefront of countering the coronavirus. Now, this was a sort of a long, drawn-out, bureaucratically challenging disinformation operation. It involved planting fake news stories in obscure press, and they were picked up by the Soviet mainstream press, and then eventually picked up by Western media. And there's a long-term damaging, there's a long-term damage that this conspiracy theory promoted by the KGB, we now know from Soviet records, has caused on societies across the world. A staggering number of polled populations, in particular African American populations in the US in the early 2000s, still thought that AIDS was a man-made virus. So here's a striking example of the long-term damage that this can cause. That story also provides, I think, lessons for how to counter it. And that is the history of countering the KGB disinformation AIDS virus conspiracy theory was to report on it, to attribute it to its origins, in that case, the Kremlin, and to publicize, expose that. And that is actually what the Trump administration has done, if publicly this disinformation operation, the story that was being promulgated by Chinese officials. And I think that as the 2020 election approaches, alas, we're going to find more of that. And that's going to require an even more accelerated response, joined up across government. The history of dealing with the KGB AIDS virus conspiracy theory shows the importance of having a joined up international approach with one dedicated agency or bureaucracy to produce rapid response, fact-based rebuttals against disinformation. Now, in the internet age and the cyber age that we're all living in, that's going to, it seems to me, have to involve social media companies that are being used as platforms to spread disinformation.
Thanks, Calder. I appreciate that, and I must say I found your 4 different priorities or new priorities post COVID-19 to be a useful way to think about it.
I was just going to say the final one, which is really segueing into Bobby's area, is about collecting intelligence of big bulk data on populations. I called it surveillance of populations. Surveillance is a problematic term, but the reforms of U.S. intelligence, it seems to me, is going to have to involve a balance that we want to strike between public health security and civil liberties or human rights. And where do we draw that balance?
That makes perfect sense. And we're going to get there in just a second. But before we do, there was one area that I guess I would say I would add to your list. And I'll maybe ask Paul, given his experience in strategic intelligence and at the National Intelligence Council, to talk a little bit more about this. But I'd see our national decision makers, even our domestic security organizations, just intently focused on the challenge we face here domestically in the United States. And I'm wondering, what does the target deck look like for U.S. intelligence right now with its focus on overseas information and assessments? And I thought about it just for a minute and almost made my head hurt, thinking about the consequences for the United States of how this pandemic plays out overseas, right? We're all still focused on the developed world at this point, watching our statistics, watching our charts, taking responsive actions. I don't think many experts that I've heard talk about this say, we haven't seen the impact in the third world yet, and it's coming. And I think about the impact on third world nations, the impact on elite deaths, national capacity, economic instability, migration flows, possible great power shifts. There are already wars that have been difficult to bring to a close are now in ceasefire while the states deal with this impending threat. So it seems to me the world's a highly unstable place right now. And there could be major shifts underway driven by this virus. And it seems squarely the job of U.S. intelligence not to allow us to be surprised by how the coming months and years play out overseas as a result of the shock of this virus. But Paul, what would a collection deck look like? What would you worry about if you were responsible for taking precious time away from the president's schedule to tell him about what's going on outside our borders and what we need to be worried about?
Well, good question, and there's a lot to cover there, and I won't try to cover all of it in terms of the span of things. So what you have is you have the totality of your existing collection deck, and then you have this new set of challenges and problems, and you have to reconcile those two things. And so the first point I would like to make is that there's a lot the IC can do, and all the agencies and collection ints have something to contribute on various questions that are going to arise here. And so that's an important point. I'll just give you an example. If you take imagery as an example, and Steve, you go to your point about the third world. I mean, NGA has really partnered with the private sector and with the public even, and basically gives away low-level imagery. And I think we could do a lot to monitor what's happening in remote parts of the world using, with just some organizing principles coming from the IC. And a lot of it could actually be done at the unclassified level because of the now fact that we have imagery that isn't sensitive imagery. A really important part I want to come back to, though, is a point that Calder made about secrets. I mean, there's some secrets out there that we'd like to know. And I think that there's a comparative advantage that the IC has in this world. This is something I try to teach my students, that, everybody on a campus, all the departments have people that do research and understand the integrity of data and information, that kind of thing. But in the intel business, you're actually trying to get information from an adversary that's actively trying to give you disinformation, to use deception, to and actively deny your collection. So everything we want to know about this virus is not going to be, or not the virus, but the pandemic response is not going to be a secret, but some things are. So obviously, NSA, CIA are going to be tasked to work on those things. I think, Steve, right now I'm imagining that, you and I aren't on the inside anymore. And I always believe when you're out, so I try not to speak for the agency. But I can imagine, as being a chief of station on 9/11, that there have been a series of cables that have been sent to chiefs and to those elements that are in the foreign field or collectors from the United States. They're giving them a set of priorities of things that they want. And, one of the things I like about being a chief of station, and one of the cables I got after 9/11 that I treasure, I got two actually, one from the DDO and one from the director of CIA. And they said something like, we can't tell you we have these priorities, but we can't tell you what all your local priorities are. You're smart. That's why we picked you. Go get the stuff we need the most. The military calls that mission orders. And so I think if you're in Sudan, there's some important information that you can probably collect on, what's happening in the third world. Whereas if you're in Beijing or Moscow or running collection programs associated with the Chinese or Russians, the Iranians, that kind of thing, there's going to be a lot that we need. I just want to come back to one other thing I said earlier, if I can, and that is that I'm going to make a controversial comment here. I actually believe the United States would be better off. We would have a better understanding of what's happening to us if there was no such thing as a COVID-19 test. Because what has happened is we have insisted on good testing data when we didn't have the dadgum test to give people. Okay, and it's very analogous to the Challenger failure, where it actually failed because we insisted on good data. People were arguing that, that the O-rings wouldn't work at a certain temperature, and people said, well, we don't have that. So right now, we're grossly overestimating the fatality rate in the United States because we don't have the test to test people that have had the virus and recovered from it. Analysts do this all the time, and they would have come up with a model that would have been closer. So obviously tests are a good thing. I'm not against the test, but my point is when you don't have the testing data, you have to use reason and analysis. So I think the combination of the tradecraft that our analysts have in some of these areas where we have black holes, we can't just keep insisting on better data or, scolding the Chinese because the data that they're giving us, we don't trust. We're going to have to come up with both collection and analytic approaches to fill in what we don't know on this and future pandemics, in my opinion.
Thanks for that, Paul. And I also would echo your mention of chiefs of station in the foreign field. We don't have time to devote a lot of attention to it today, but I'm mindful of the tremendous organizational and bureaucratic responsibilities that leaders of our intelligence agencies have right now. So they have all this important work to do, yet they're subject to all the same restrictions we are in a fairly unforgiving security environment. So we should bear in mind that U.S. intelligence has people deployed literally around the world in places where they're completely unacceptable health conditions and healthcare systems, and to keep the people safe, to keep the work getting done, to keep the secret secret. The people who run CIA and the people who run the intelligence community, the other main agencies, have an enormous task ahead of them to do all this important work, while at the same time caring for their most important resource, which is their people, keeping them healthy, keeping them functioning.
I just want to add one thing, just sort of, and that they have their families also in many cases.
My wife is walking around in the background here, so we'll take note of the acknowledgement of families. Very important. Bobby, I want to turn now to technology. Calder sort of previewed it a minute ago. I mean, no aspect of our modern lives. Here we are on a digital platform meeting from 3 different states and hopefully communicating with hundreds or thousands of people scattered around the world. Just an illustration of the remarkable changes. I don't know anybody who's any more thoughtful about this than you are, the intersection of national security and law and technology. So how do you think about this? I mean, obviously there are reports coming in of foreign countries, whether it's China, whether it's Israel, whether it's European states, using technology in ways both inside their boundaries and outside their boundaries in a way that they think will help inform their response to the pandemic. We're contemplating, as you mentioned, using sophisticated technology to help us with our own response. But at the same time, we're mindful of the constitutional aspect of this, the privacy and civil liberties that are in jeopardy if we don't apply this technology smartly. So where are you on this right now?
Well, I, of course, am really glad you asked about that. It is something I've been working on a piece for Lawfare for the past couple of days, and I'll probably put that out on Monday if I can get my act together. And my aim is just what you proposed right now, which is to provide sort of a roadmap of how to think about the issue, as opposed to claiming here's the right answer. So here's some preliminary thoughts, and this isn't very well organized. I think it helps to begin, especially since we've been approaching the issue through the lens of intelligence and the IC's role, to note how on the domestic side of this question, This is one of those areas where it makes a lot of sense in the abstract to think about this as an intelligence problem, but institutionally, it falls mostly outside the boundaries, at least as traditionally conceived, of the IC. If you go and look at Department of Health and Human Services, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response is the part of that operation that sort of sits on top of this issue. And they actually have a national health security strategy. Now, nobody reads national strategy documents in general anyways. Those who do read them tend not to read this one. But lo and behold, now we discovered that that's a document we ought to look at. There's a 2019 to 2022 document from the ASPR that talks a lot about surveillance, which of course in public health circles, we don't talk about intelligence gathering and intelligence collection. They talk generally about public health surveillance, by which they mean creating systems of information uptake so that bodies like the CDC or the WHO can be alerted that something is unfolding. It's not as robust a concept with all its complexities with the different ints as we're used to in the IC context. That said, part of what it encompasses is what we might characterize as medical intelligence, or MedInt is sometimes used. There's a British category that's used there. I'm not sure if we use that often in the US, but it's on point for us. We're not talking about the thing now that we were talking about earlier, which was the foreign intelligence aspects of this, which loom really large in understanding this story. No, we're talking about the domestic MedInt category, information or intelligence about who's infected, who they've been in contact with, and where they are currently. And again, from the IC perspective, this begins to sound and look a little analogous, though quite different in context, from the manhunting and human tracking that we're used to thinking of in the counterterrorism setting, where we first need to answer who questions about who is it that we think is the dangerous person, the member of Al-Qaeda, et cetera. And then we have to answer the where question. Where are they right now if we need to take some action against them, or at least want to monitor what they're up to? We've got the same thing here. We've got a set of domestic information challenges that are medical intelligence challenges about figuring out who is infected. And to Paul's point, because we have royally screwed up the job of trying to establish ubiquitous, easy, comprehensive testing, and we're still miles away from success there, we have a tremendous problem under the WHO heading. And it's not just who's infected, of course, but it's also who have they been in contact with. This is a classic area of public health epidemiological investigation known as contact tracing. And of course, from the national security perspective, it immediately you start recognizing the parallels to the bulk metadata terrorist surveillance program type activity, where the idea was later on, after discovering the phone number of a suspected Al-Qaeda member, maybe we could run that through a haystack of prior phone calls to do contact tracing. Well, this is an old story for public health epidemiological investigations. The status quo for all this basically breaks down as follows. In terms of identifying who's infected, we are going through this slow glacial growth of creating testing opportunities. And half the times it seems the test doesn't even prove to be that reliable. We're going to have to improve our game on the testing front so that we can know who the persons of interest are. On the contact tracing front, the standard way of doing this is for field investigators who are heroic individuals who are going to dig into these cases like detectives on Law and Order to interview the infected to find out as best they can from them who they've been in close contact with within the past 14 days or whatever time frame is selected. That's not scalable, at least not realistically scalable, certainly not in the short term. And so what we're seeing around the world is turning to technology to try to solve that problem. So most people, when they talk about the privacy versus public health interest or public health security trade-offs, they're usually thinking about things that might be done through technology to try to ramp up and scale up and make more comprehensive and reliable the contact tracing game. I'll just pause to note that there's also interesting similar questions about the infection detection game as well, because there's talk about expanding the use of the sorts of tools we associate with facial recognition, trying to use thermal imaging to detect who might be sick and to steer interventions towards those people who may have no idea that they might need to go get tested, that opens the door to a possible expansion of public surveillance of that kind that previously we've not been comfortable with. But focusing on contact tracing, what you're seeing is a desire to create a technical means to get beyond having to just interview somebody because memory may be faulty, because people may be non-cooperative, or it just may not be scalable that way. Well, how do you do that? In an ideal world, strictly from the public health perspective, you'd have a comprehensive database somehow magically of everyone that you were in close contact with over the past 14 days. Happily, that doesn't actually exist because it's somewhat of a terrifying concept that there might just be some universal comprehensive record of everybody you've been near at all times in all places. So the question is, can we move towards something like that in a way that we can tolerate from a privacy and liberties perspective once this is all over, with some degree of effectiveness? What we're seeing in a number of countries is the distribution of a voluntarily adopted app that you put on your phone and in some way or fashion might be used to track your movements. Obviously, you could make that compulsory too. And the more compulsory you make it, the more danger it is from a legacy of surveillance kind of perspective. I'll just close this already overly long comment by saying that there's some interesting techniques being developed. And I'm thinking here in particular of something that MIT is working on, where the idea is to have your phone, if you've accepted the app that they're developing, it's using its Bluetooth connectivity to constantly chirp at other phones that might be or other devices that are in Bluetooth range, not to create a permanent record of Steve Slick was here in Austin at this location in the office with Paul Pope at this date, but rather to create a record of encrypted contacts that, and I'm greatly oversimplifying here, but the idea is it doesn't actually track where you were. It tracks that you were and that your phone connected to another phone. And that later on, in a properly controlled way, if and when you turn out to be infected, you can notify that system and anyone that your phone connected to in the relevant date range, the counterparties could get a notification. That sort of contact tracing seems, I think, very likely to occur for us if we really are going to move beyond what we're currently doing, which is the shotgun approach to sheltering in place, where everybody, even those actually not infected and not in contact with someone infected, just stays locked down. There's obviously tremendous pressure to try to revive the economy, economic life, political life, cultural life, social life, and people are looking for these more targeted solutions.
Yeah, I have a question for Bobby. Bobby, you were talking about cell phones and things like that. And my concern, I've mentioned it a couple of times, is that we passed the opportunity to get a lot of data that I think we had readily available. And one area that I don't know what who in the federal government, if anyone, can legally do this, but is things like Google searches and things like that. Because many people, I believe, are sitting in an apartment in New York right now with the virus who nobody has it in the public health records that they actually have the virus because they've never been tested. I think it may be as high as 5 to 10 times as many people have it as what we know have it. But they're all Google searching symptoms and things like that. So is that something we can use legally?
I don't think that. So that the way you framed it, it goes to the who's infected question. And although we do know that on the whole, there's evidence you can predict the emergence of outbreaks of, say the seasonal flu, and some would say this as well by examining the net results of Google search data. I don't know that we could get from that level of granularity to digging into particular cases and saying this particular person's infected. And so I think there could be enough of a gap there to where it won't be a useful tool. But there's a version of that same idea that goes towards the, well, where are they question, or who have they been in touch with? Because there's any number of apps on our phones that are constantly, unless you've been very careful to police what they can do, constantly track your location, where you've been. And some of these at least might have records that epidemiological investigation could, in theory, benefit from. But there's a privacy cost to this. If the person who if we're trying to track, say, you, Paul, and your past movements, and you've been identified as infected and you consent, then we don't have a problem up to a certain point. The more interesting question is, what about doing it on a non-consent basis? And that gets into a question of what are exactly the subpoena-like authorities or the warrant-seeking authorities of public health investigators. And that's a question that arises mainly at the state and local level. And so this question I know, Calder, you had raised earlier as well, do we need legislation to do any of the more exotic things that might be desirable from a public health perspective? I don't have a firm view of that yet. It's possible that for some of the more aggressive moves, you would need some sort of clarification of authority, because a lot of this information is probably best understood in light of the Supreme Court's Carpenter decision from a couple of years ago as having warrant level protection under the Fourth Amendment. If we're talking about a batch of historical movement data, we have to have ubiquitous, reliable testing, constant recurring testing, and you got to have scalable, reliable contact tracing if we're really going to do that without taking on some really serious public health risk.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Bobby. I have just one follow-up question for you, and maybe an observation. I didn't pay nearly as close attention in law school as you did, which is why you're where you're at and I'm where I'm at. But I do remember, reading extensively about case law from World War II, in particular the Fred Korematsu case. And I'm just reminded, as I'm sure you remind your students, that a national crisis is a pretty dangerous time to be making policy and making law. Our record's not particularly good at that. And so having smart people like you and Ben Wittes and the circle at Lawfare thinking and writing about this is probably really time well spent. The other one is, again, near and dear to my heart, the Israelis. When it comes to security and technology, they can be counted on to be out of the gate first and doing some very smart and creative things. A lot of what you were describing there, I guess maybe you'd call electronic fencing or something like that, or these warnings that come through your smartphone. So a comment on what you understand is going on in Israel, and in particular, something that I found a little maybe worth discussing or suspect on one level. They assign this responsibility to the Shin Bet, the Shabak, the Internal Security Service, which on first blush, they don't consult with me on their national security policies, but doesn't seem like the right place to house this, notwithstanding the technical competence that inevitably you find in a high-performance organization like that. What would you say about what the Israelis are doing? Because I think they're out a couple steps ahead of most of the rest of us on this.
Yeah, there's no question that was from a who could most quickly act perspective. There was a certain logic to it. In particular, there were existing authorities and capabilities that Shin Bet has that could be thrown on like a light switch, relatively speaking, compared to the alternatives. So I understand only a little bit about the precise details, but I get it why they went the way they did. We don't have. That's not true for RIC. There's not some existing capability that NSA has, the CIA has, that FBI has, that any federal entity has, that has been created and put in place for purposes of contact tracing and manhunting that we might have for counterterrorism purposes that could then be just immediately repurposed if we were willing to empower that group to turn domestically towards public health. So there's really little justification for making that move. The public health capabilities and indeed the regular law enforcement capabilities are actually widely distributed at the state and local level in our totally different federal system. The federal capabilities we've got are extremely potent as to what's directed outside the United States. So it doesn't make sense as a model for the United States, at least at first blush. When you read the National Health Security Strategy from HHS, which really is an interesting document to read with the benefit of our hindsight, it's all about finding ways in which interagency partners can do things that will support CDC at the federal level, where CDC is really the lead agency for what they would call epidemiological investigation, but from an IC perspective, we might view as a form of medical intelligence. And that in turn is largely supportive of state and local authorities, which are traditionally always the first rung in public health emergencies. Now, given the global scale and obviously the national scale of this particular public health problem, we can't have a 50-state variety of solutions. We do need coordination. And so here the CDC role is really important. We should be thinking in terms of what is it we can do by way of federal coordination to support these localized efforts.
Thanks very much for that, Bobby. I wanted to turn the corner here and talk about something a little bit different, closer to ideology and sort of grand strategy. And I'm going to park the first part of the question. This has to do with whether this global crisis, this global emergency, as serving as a pretext for leaders and policies that are more authoritarian, more nationalistic, and maybe less accommodating to America's traditional view of the world, right? Democratic governance, liberal free market economies. This is a broader subject of whether authoritarianism and nationalism are generally on the rise. But it seems to me there's a greater concern now with this health emergency underway. And obviously some examples from Central Europe and other places where leaders that may be inclined in this direction are frankly taking advantage of the opportunity and probably not likely to cede back to the people the rights that they're seizing to deal with the emergency. But I think we have our own issue at home that we need to talk about in that regard. And Bobby, I'll start with you because I know your friend Ben Wittes wrote a terrific piece the other day asking us why we're not outraged that last Friday, actually a couple hours from now, during that traditionally dead time in the national media cycle when presidents hide things they don't want to have to talk about, the president sacked Michael Atkinson, the Inspector General for the intelligence community. He told everybody why. And there was some modest criticism came from Capitol Hill, maybe some follow-up from the intelligence and other committees. But then within days or hours of that, he turned around and sacked the Inspector General, the acting Inspector General, Glenn Fine, at the Defense Department. Both by my experience and all accounts, tremendously capable public servants and officers of the court. And so do we have an authoritarian problem here in the United States with this crisis serving as cover for taking some, what I regard as extremely suspect actions against democratic institutions, oversight institutions, and personalities? Bobby?
I think if you put it in context, these are examples, not initial proofs of such a problem. There's always, to some extent, that danger. This goes back to the competing views of Hobbes and Locke. There's always some danger when you create strong central government to deal with your problems. You have to be aware of the possibility of abuse from that strong central government. I think it's obvious that in recent years, we've had an exacerbation of that problem because we have a president that, in my opinion, has manifested in his words and his deeds on many occasions that he doesn't accept. Certainly doesn't accept many of the norms that have traditionally limited federal power and executive branch power. And in some contexts, hasn't shown any respect for the legal constraints either. Firing inspectors general is within his legal authority. So we talked about this past week on the National Security Law podcast. It's clear at the constitutional and statutory level that these removals were permissible as a legal matter. The legal lens, to say something is legal isn't to say that it's right, as we like to remind our students. That's a separate question, or that it's desirable. And so I do think that when you make clear that you're firing the Inspector General of the intelligence community because of his compliance with relevant statutory law regarding his duties, you're sending yet another dangerous signal. So I accept that. Why we're not outraged? I think plenty of people are outraged, but more people have factored this sort of thing into the stock price long ago. And there's fatigue in terms of getting excited about yet another example of some norm violating behavior or some outrageous thing. It's just what people have come to expect. And then you layer in on top of that the all-consuming nature of the COVID news cycle. It's all there is on any channel all the time. and these other topics are easily submerged under that. That's a dangerous state of affairs, no question about it.
Thank you, Bobby. Yeah, as you were explaining that, I was thinking scared and distracted. And I think we have a president who's taken advantage of those conditions in ways that have long-term deleterious impacts. I'm not inviting outrage or piling on, but Calder or Paul, do you have a thought on this and the impacts on democratic legitimacy and oversight of our very powerful, very large security agencies?
Well, I just make a couple of comments broadly speaking. One is that when we have these events, these crises, we mentioned Pearl Harbor, mentioned 9/11. Now we have this crisis, we have others. There is a public desire for security, and it's not only that the public will tolerate intrusions into what were previously areas that they would have protected on their privacy or whatever. In some cases, they actually demand it if that's what's necessary for security. And you can actually see this in the timing. For example, I had a student ask me the other day about the Feinstein report on rendition and interrogation. And I said, she didn't do that till 10 years after 9/11, because if she tried to do it 3 years after 9/11, people would say, we don't care. If that's what it takes to protect us, do it. So, we have the opportunity for authoritarian leaders to move into this space, whether they're doing it as a political strategy or just because they can. It's something granted to them by the people. And so, my point is we need to, and trust in institutions, I think, is something that we've lost a lot of here as well. The other point I would just make, Steve, with regard to the current crisis, not just the loss for the long term for this authoritarianism creep, but in the current crisis, I'm worried about a loss of space for having a discussion about what the rational, smart national security thing to do is. It's just almost impossible to find a way to have that kind of conversation now that isn't hijacked by political considerations. And so I see that as linked to this issue, where everything is either being done for political purposes or being perceived as being done for political purposes, when in many cases we're literally, talking about, national security issues that affect all of us.
Calder, we're coming towards the bitter end. Any concluding or complementary thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I would just like to agree that I do think what we're witnessing at the moment domestically in the US is a test of authoritarian leadership. It seems to me that even before the coronavirus pandemic, the world was really seeing a clash of civilizations between liberal democracies and authoritarian rule. And it's certainly the view from Russia, which I know best about, is look at how democracies are failing their citizens. And that, the Cold War was won by the West, but in fact, look at how badly the US is looking after its own citizens. And this was, from their perspective, certainly this is a clash of civilizations. And it seems to me that the really dangerous thing that we all need to be aware of at the moment is that this enormous pandemic could be used to institute authoritarian type laws, practices, surveillance domestically in the US. And I do agree that this president has pushed, it seems to me, my own view is that has pushed the limits as far as anyone has ever done in terms of the rule of law domestically in the US. Throughout history, I'll just finish with this, that history is full of illustrations and warnings of where legislation passed during emergencies have a tendency to stay on even after those emergencies have passed. So any kind of encroachment into the kind of surveillance bulk data that Bobby has described, I think that the key thing going forward will be to be absolutely transparent about how that data is used and accountable.
Thanks for that. This has been terrific, guys, but you're not free yet. We're going to end on that. That was all sort of on a downward trajectory, a little pessimism. We can't end that way, not in times like these. So I want to end on a positive note. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to acknowledge that we're all doing our part. We're sequestered, we're sheltered in place. We're leading by example for our students. But I'd ask each of you real quickly, a quick shot. What have you learned while you've been locked up at home? What are you most grateful for? What have you learned about yourself? What's the upside of sequestration other than enjoyable conversations like this one? Speed round. Bobby?
Yeah, that's an easy one for me because I'm home with my wife and my 3 children who are teenager and younger. And as difficult as some things has been, the enforced time with family, especially with the kids, has been something that I've really treasured on that dimension. I feel very lucky that I'm in a position to have that safe, locked in time with the kids. I doubt and don't know that they would answer it quite the same way, but it's been really great from my perspective on that dimension.
Calder, what's the silver lining?
Silver lining is being close to family and friends, even when you're not physically close. You can still be incredibly close through these kind of platforms. And it really, I think that the silver lining is it's forcing us to rethink the way that we interact with each other, that even though we're not physically present, it's so easy now to be virtually present with each other. And that, for me, is better than nothing. Thanks.
Paul?
Yeah, I would say the same things about family and on the technology front. I just think that, we're really pushing the envelope there are lots of people that have used this kind of technology before, but there's a whole parts of society that haven't, and it's really opening up some ideas for how we can do things better and differently in the future. There's a dark cloud inside the silver lining, okay, and the dark cloud is that we're very dependent on this technology, and if you do the COVID-19 scenario for cyber, and we can't do this, we've got a problem because we're a lot more dependent. So these are some thoughts that I've been having at the big picture level of what's going on. I think we're going to look back at this. I told Bobby today in a little email, I think we're going to look back at this the way Brits look at the Battle of Britain or the Blitz. It'll be mixed emotions of good and bad when we think back to this time. We'll learn a lot.
And ideally a source of national pride at the end of the day. So thanks for that. But I'll chime in as well. I mean, in addition to being close to family and the miracle of technology that allows us to get a few things done, I learned that I don't like to be in one place. I've got a lifetime case of the Wanderlust, probably a great quality to have for a CIA operations officer. But I got to get out and get moving around and learn some things. So watch this space. All right, so with that, I'll thank each of our guests today and also wish the listeners and readers at War on the Rocks good health and a productive sequestration. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.